You're listening to the Veterans Impact Show, continuing the mission of service and bringing together our civilian and military communities. Brought to you by Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Don't worry, retire happy and work with us.
All right, here we go. Welcome back. Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Excited to kick off the first show of the year. You will notice that I am flying solo. Unfortunately, the founder and really the heart and soul of the show was poor Jim is coughing and hacking and just generally not ready for prime time this morning. So he's listening. I'm sure he's going to put some notes in the chat box. We welcome everybody to put a note in the chat box. Find us on Facebook. Find us on our YouTube channel. Subscribe to those. Throw some notes out there. Tell us what you think. Super excited to kick off the show with one of our absolute favorite guests. And this is Col John Antal, who is a retired colonel, armor officer in the Army. That's always hard to say, an Army armored officer. It meant he drove tanks, basically, for those who don't know what that is. But one of the reasons we really enjoy him, he is a best-selling author. But this is the thing, and John, this is where we were talking off the air, and John's kind of going, oh, God, what's he going to say now? This is one of the reasons it's so interesting to listen and talk to John, is because unfortunately, the military and military general officers and thinkers are busy fighting the last war. John looks forward and is busy fighting the next war. And I say that because this gets into part of what we're going to talk about today, which is John's ability to think. And unfortunately, in America, we have too much groupthink. And that's going to be part of what we're going to talk about. We're going to do a little bit of a civics lesson today and keep this very timely. Wanted to talk about, do we have John's website? Speaking of author, we want to do a little commercial first.
Yep.
And
looks good.
leadershiprising.net. Great site to check out his books. He's got a short book that talks about the power of leadership and actually almost a workbook in that it will walk you through. What's your leadership style? How does this impact what you do? Leadership is so incredibly important at every level. We've seen some great examples of it. It's certainly, speaking of leadership, last night, we finally got a Speaker of the House, and it went through 15 rounds of voting. It was very interesting because we're going to talk about that because this is not quite the chaos. And so we're very interested to start out talking about John's thoughts on how this was not the chaos that some of the media want to make it out to be. But this is actually part of the process. John, Happy New Year, my friend. It's good to see you in that great-looking library of yours.
Happy New Year, Chuck. How are you?
And I am doing good. I am certainly doing better than my partner in crime, Jim Blythe.
Well, I wish him well. And, Jim, if you're listening, get well soon. We need you. Not that Chuck can't do it now, but we need you.
Well, the beauty, and we were joking before the show, the beauty of it when John's on, I don't have to do much. And speaking of that, I'm going to turn it over to you, but share some thoughts about this week-long trial and tribulation of electing a speaker, but let's drill a little deeper into how this is actually part of the process of how we legislate.
Yeah, it's very interesting that many people I know are a little frustrated with watching the procedures in the House this last week. And many people have asked me, what are they doing? Why are they doing this? Why does this happen this way? And if you understand American history and you've ever read anything about the development of our Constitution, you'll see that this is very much the process that our founding fathers had in mind when they started our republic. Now, one of the things that you're going to hear over and over again in the in the media is how our democracy needs this and our democracy does this and there's chaos in the democracy and democracy. Well, there's a difference between a democracy and a constitutional republic. Now, we are a democratic constitutional republic, meaning that we embrace many of the ideas of democracy, but democracy, pure and simple, is not what we are.
No.
A democracy is a vote by the majority for issues. A democracy is what Athens had, in 430 BC, and the Athenians decided that a guy named Socrates, who was a philosopher, was speaking things they didn't like. It was making them very, very, very nervous and very uncomfortable. So they ordered that he be put to death. And Socrates, their greatest philosopher, went to prison and then was ordered to take poison. So the challenge is that democracies don't last long. And our founding fathers looked at democracy being one person, one citizen, one vote for every issue. And they said, this isn't going to work very well in our modern world. And this was 1776 when they were doing this. And they said, we need to have a different idea. We need to have a constitutional republic. But before I get into what that is, we need to talk about freedom and liberty.
Okay.
So, Chuck, what do you think freedom is? Put you on the spot here.
Boy, you did. I didn't know that question was coming. So freedom, and my simplest answer would be we look at the things that are protected by our Bill of Rights, and I believe there are now 27 or 28 line items in the Bill of Rights, but we think of those first 10, starting with things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, and we jump down to number 4, which is probably the second most famous, which is basically due process. So I'm gonna cop out because I'm fascinated to see where you're going to go with this. I'm going to say, that's kind of what I think of freedom, the ability for Jim and I to put on a radio show where nobody's censoring what we're saying. And the beauty of putting it out on Facebook and YouTube is we literally can pretty much, we're not even constrained by the FCC.
Okay, so what is liberty?
Now you've really put me on the spot.
You see, we want a revolution for liberty.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm another cop out. I'm going to quote a Supreme Court justice. I can't define pornography, but I know what I say. I don't, and I say that, and it's kind of silly, but it is a concept that I sort of feel, but I can't define it.
Yeah, what's really important when you're a leader or an influencer, which is what leadership's all about. Leadership is the art of influence. If in fact you want to influence people, one of the things that is very, very helpful is that you change fuzzy thinking into focused thinking. And you see, most of the subjects we have issues with are because of fuzzy thinking. In other words, we kind of think we know, kind of like, maybe, but we really haven't thought about it.
Right.
That's one of the things I did in my book, Leadership Rising, was I tried to get the reader to focus on who they were. In other words, who are you? And you go, well, I'm blah, blah, blah. But is that really you? What do you believe in? What do you stand for? What would you fight for? What would you die for if you had to? What are your true beliefs? That's one of the big questions that come out of a self-examination. And that's one of the things I do in that book, Leadership Rising. But what we're talking about the difference between freedom and liberty. So America fought a revolution against Great Britain for liberty. Now, we wanted freedom, but freedom and liberty are two different things, very closely related, but did two different things. So a definition of freedom is the ability to do what you want to do without anyone else coercing you to do something else. In other words, if you're a slave you have no freedom because you're told what to do every day.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in your job, you may have some freedom, but your freedom is narrowed. You have to do certain things. Otherwise, people won't hire you because you won't produce anything.
Right.
Ultimate freedom would be you're not responsible for anything and no one can tell you what to do.
But that's also anarchy when we go to that extreme.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. So you see, freedom is very important, and you could be free in China if you become a monk and you just don't pay attention to anything else and you don't care. You see, freedom can be had almost anywhere if you want it. But if you want political freedom, if you want the ability to live in a system that has rule of law and that enshrines your freedoms in a Bill of Rights and a Constitution, that's liberty. So you see, what our founding fathers were fighting against was a tyrannical government that was telling them what to do, the British Crown, that was saying, you must pay these taxes, you can't have weapons, you can't do this, you can't assemble unless we tell you to. All of the things that are in our bill, most of the things that are in our Bill of Rights were a direct result of the experiences of our founding fathers in their struggle against Great Britain. Because what Great Britain was a kingdom, and it was an empire, and their thought was, well, the colonies work for us.
Right.
We make money through them. They have to do what we tell them to do. They don't have a choice. So we had neither freedom nor liberty. Now, what we wanted to be was free of Great Britain, and we wanted liberty, which is freedom enshrined in law and a constitution, and in the United States, it's shown in our Bill of Rights, which is so powerful. Our Constitutional Convention was an absolute mess. If the drive-by media had been talking about the Constitutional Convention when the Constitution was being created, they would have been saying much of what they said last week. I think it's really powerful and it's really useful and refreshing, I think, in a way, to see that representatives of the people, representatives who have been sent to a Congress to represent people, because the government's supposed to work for us, we're not supposed to work for the government, are now trying to shift a government that has been so centric on you, we are the government, you work for us. We have a problem now in our government that it has become so big, and it has become so powerful, and it has so many levers with which it can change things, that oftentimes they forget the idea that the entire concept of the United States of America was that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God, and that each one of us deserves liberty, but we have to fight for that liberty, and we have to maintain that liberty. And one of the ways you have to maintain it is to be informed and to change fuzzy thinking into focused thinking, so you can talk and discuss this with other people.
I love it. I love what you're saying, and it harkens on to two deep concerns that I have with society where it is today. And the first of those is we no longer teach civics in school. And by doing that, nobody knows this history. People don't understand it, and they have to go outside of our school system. And the other one that really I just don't get anymore, and we were talking about Socrates and being a philosopher, we don't teach philosophy and logic. It's not a requirement to take those courses to get a degree from higher education for the most part today. And it's like, we don't teach people how to think. And just like you talk about in Leadership Rising, everybody who is a leader, everybody who is, and I love that influencer term, you've got to have that skill set to function. So we are 10 seconds away. We are going to take a break. We are going to come back on the flip side.
Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation.
Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome back. We wanted to take just a minute to do two things. We want to thank our friends at No Bull Radio down in South Texas that we are broadcasting on. This is back in my old stomping grounds, Pearsall, Dilley, and all these little towns. I've got, I'm not sure I've got many relatives left. I think they've all moved up to San Antonio. For those who follow the show know I went to high school and college in San Antonio. Great town, but so we've got our South Texas fans. Other thing that I want to do is to say Happy New Year to our crew. Nathaniel Smith, who's running all the electronics and the board over there that's too complicated for me to understand, but he thinks it's too simple. And he is with Ascend Podcast and doing some great work. We just hope we can keep him. And the lovely Mrs. Diane Blythe, who's in studio today, because fortunately, whatever Jim has that has my partner in crime missing a first show of the year has not affected her, at least so far. We are talking. Oh, she was making faces at me. Sorry. She does stuff off camera to try to break our stride and our rhythm, and she's kind of that way. Hey, we are talking with John Antal, Colonel John Antal, U.S. Army armor officer, retired. Yes, he drove tanks. But it's interesting because I find John to be one of those true thinkers and a fascinating man. And we're going to get into it in the second half of the show. But his website, leadershiprising.net, he has written several books, best-selling author. There we go. For those of us on watching on Facebook and YouTube, you can see the website. Go to it, check out the book. It's a short read, and having been a Marine, I appreciate short reads. It can't be too long, and the notes have to be large enough to accommodate crayon. So I'll talk about that story at some other time, but that's a Marine joke. The Army tried to, well, I'll go ahead and tell it now. The Army tried to make jokes about the Marines using crayons. And instead of getting upset about it and getting offended and, whining and crying on social media, we embraced it. We just absolutely embraced it. We thought it was great. But we're talking...
Simple is better.
Yeah, absolutely. John is talking about a couple of concepts, and it really is incredibly timely because last night, as I mentioned in the first segment, after 15 rounds of voting, we now have a Speaker of the House. Congress has been sworn in, and it's time for government to get back to work, although we now have a divided Congress. And personally, I think that's a good thing. I would rather have gridlock than too much spending, but I'm going to try not to go too political with that. But John, let's continue this conversation because one of the things that I talked about is we're not teaching civics. We're not focused on it. It is almost as if it has become a taboo subject. And talk about some of the real-world implications of that and the importance of the leadership that you talk about in the book, Leadership Rising.
Well, thank you, Chuck, and a Happy New Year to everyone. It's great to be on the show, and I will tell you that the question we're talking about is really important for everyone to think about. So when you think, why would anyone not want to have the most educated, most informed, most diverse in thinking, being able to apply all sorts of different ideas and engage in the forum of conversation and ideas to understand what human nature is all about? Why wouldn't we want that?
That's a good question.
Well, if the citizens are uninformed and ignorant, what does that lead to?
Well,
A dictatorship.
yeah, I was going to say the flash I see is propaganda in Nazi Germany.
Well, very good. I mean, the idea is that if you keep people uninformed,
Yep.
then they're easier to control.
Yep.
You see, the greatest freedom we have individually is the ability to think for ourselves. The ability to think for yourself. Now, to think for yourself, you have got to think. And you've got to review some of the issues to understand what you're thinking about. You can feel certain ways, and feelings are great, but thoughts and logic are also important. And if you don't have thoughts about the important things in life, then you go through life kind of bouncing from one situation to the next, and then it's over. And if you, in fact, want to control other people, the best way that some people who want power want to control people is to keep them uninformed. So there's an interesting fact that in our school systems, we are producing what many believe is a less educated and less informed group of fellows.
We're going to continue this conversation. We've got to take a quick break.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation.
Welcome back. John, continue that thought because we had to take a break, but I think it was a really salient point that you had made. And it's really important that as we are in an age where I can pull out my cell phone in my back pocket and I have more computing power and access to more information than the entire NASA space project that put a man on the moon. And it almost boggles the mind.
Yeah, it was 32 kilobytes. Saying that you get in a greeting card.
Wow.
But you know where the real computing power was when we landed on the moon?
I'm going to guess in human brains. Yeah, there we go.
Exactly.
I got one right today.
Never underestimate the value of human beings. That's one of the reasons that people who think that we need fewer people on Earth because we're eating up all the resources and using all the resources, they just don't get it.
Okay,
human beings.
I was going to throw in one of my favorite pieces of trivia. People say that the Earth is overpopulated. The problem with that is we live in the state of Texas. And if you've listened to the show, you know I love Texas. 6th and 7th generation Texan. But the interesting thing is you can put every person on the planet. I've actually done this math because I didn't believe it when I first heard it. You can put every person on the planet into the state of Texas, and every one of them would have their own unique 2,000 square feet. True story.
Well, that tells you that Texas is big.
Texas is big, but the world is not that overpopulated. But continue with this.
What's interesting is that you see if you're in a closed system where you can't get out, and let's say you're put in a room and you have 6 people, 10 people, 15 people. Well, eventually that you can't get enough people in the room.
Right.
But the world isn't like that. And one of the things that happens is that human beings are remarkable. They create new ideas. So for that previous analogy, they would create a bigger house. They would create more rooms.
Right.
So what happened was that in years past, we had the ability to feed X number of people. Now we have the ability to feed X times 10 number of people. Mm-hmm. And so human beings are able to accomplish great things. I mean, so when people start saying we don't need more humans in the world, I really worry about that because that is a very closed-minded idea.
Yes.
The idea that humans bring so much to the challenge and problems of the world, this is how we progress. This is how society advances. And this is how people get to understand the difference between just freedom and liberty. The idea that they actually think, talk, and discuss these ideas to learn. And the more that we do that in our schools, the better off I think our whole republic will be, because the only way that republics survive is with a dedicated citizenry that believes in the republic and understand how it works. You see, when you look at the history of the world, the history of humankind, the ultimate value of humanity is not freedom. It's power. So what's happened is that throughout history, individuals and groups have gained power and then wielded that power over everyone else. That's the common, the sort of the base factor of human existence. If you look at the history of China, it is predominantly, for a very, very, almost its complete history, has been ruled by autocrats, kings, and emperors, and generals. And you have no choice.
Well, and
so therefore,
for all
you
practical
obey
purposes,
and
you have an autocrat today.
Right. Oh, exactly right. He's emperor for life, Z.
Yeah.
So in China, the way they find freedom is they just get out of the system. They don't think about politics. They don't do anything. They just try to keep it within the family, and they don't worry about all those things until those things push down on them like they do every day.
Right.
So, and the same thing happens in the rest of the world. So what was so unique about the American Revolution and our whole concept of a constitutional republic was we are one of the few nations, few peoples in the history of humankind that decided that the people should rule themselves. This is the whole premise of America.
Yeah.
The premise is we're not going to be told what to do. We're going to rule ourselves and elect people, and they're going to do what we tell them to do. Now, that's an extraordinary idea. That is why America is exceptional, not because we're better looking, not because we have more money, not because we're more powerful. We're exceptional because we're one of the few in humankind that ever decided that nations should be created where the citizenry rules, not the king, not the emperor, not the dictator. Now, there's a constant battle in American history between these two concepts, between the idea that the people, we, the people, are what the government is, and the idea that the government tells you what to do. Now, we, the people, have surrendered many of our liberties to the government, and we have done so usually for reasons of security. Mm-hmm. And this is the constant issue. When we're endangered, we'll give up our liberties in order to have security. And to a certain degree, you have to be alive in order to engage liberty.
Right.
So it makes sense to live.
Yep.
But you also have to have a good balance in a republic between how much power the government has and how much power the individual has. And right now, we're in a little bit of an imbalance where the government is a bit more capable of telling us what to do than the people telling the government what to do.
So, John, talk about how what we've been talking about, these concepts of liberty and freedom, how that really, and the governing of America, how that really impacted a week-long struggle to elect a Speaker of the House, which goes much deeper than, a lot of people say, just petty, everybody wanted to be in charge. It goes much deeper than that.
Well, there certainly are personalities involved. Whenever you get people involved, it gets personal. Okay, so these people have been trying to negotiate with each other, and it got personal. And of course, when things get personal, you're going to have different reactions, emotional reactions. But the process, the concept that the individual members of Congress, the congressmen and women who are elected by their districts, by their citizens of their districts, to represent them in Congress is what this was all about. And bringing forth the ideas of the people, we the people, into this was important. So what happened was the election, of course, of the last year gave the Republican Party a majority in Congress. And when they have the majority, they get to elect the Speaker of the House. Now, they elect the Speaker of the House not through a majority vote. They have a constitutional requirement of so many members voting for them that the Founding Fathers put down on purpose. Now, this goes back to the same idea that the Founding Fathers had with the Electoral College. The idea is to balance the democratic idea and the constitutional republic idea. Now, we are a democratic constitutional republic, meaning that we solve our problems within the constitutional republic by voting on the issues. But some issues can't just be done by mob rule. For instance, why do we have an electoral college? People say it's archaic. We don't need it anymore. And they're exactly wrong.
Yes.
And the reason why they're wrong is because what happened was that America consists of, even in the 18th century, when we declared our independence against Great Britain and we became finally a nation, we had population centers that were heavy in the cities and not so much in the rural areas. Now, we wanted to bring a country together. Well, you couldn't get South Carolina to agree with New York when New York had more population than South Carolina. And if it was just majority vote, then the population centers always win. So it's dictate by the big cities.
And it's
now,
referred to as tyranny of the majority.
Right.
Well, you said mob rule. Exactly.
Right. And what would happen over time? Well, those people that feel disenfranchised would leave the system.
Right.
And that, of course, is what the founding fathers saw. They realized that if they were going to have a union, e pluribus unum, where we bring all people together, if we're going to do all this, if we're going to have a union, a United States of America, then we have to figure out a way to represent them in a way that they all get a voice. And of course, therefore, the Congress. And what you saw yesterday was, in some cases, representatives who were trying to make sure that their constituents were heard. Because for too long, many people believe Washington isn't listening. They believe Washington is telling. And if you look at these omnibus spending bills and all the other bills that have been done that nobody reads, that are just passed, then you have a problem.
Yep.
Now, some people say that, what happened last week was just chaos. It's embarrassing. And they're right. This would never happen in China.
No, it would not.
This would never happen in Russia.
There would have been 16 congressmen marched out and shot.
Yeah, this would never happen in Iran.
Right.
Okay? And this would never happen in North Korea. And those are just some extreme examples. Now, in other places, the power is so great that it would never happen there either, because the manipulation of individuals is such that they don't get their voices heard.
Right.
But we have some unique opportunities here to make sure that individual citizens actually are represented the way our founding fathers thought, and actually have a chance to get their voices heard in a government. That's really incredible. Now, the rest of the world may not understand it because they believe in power. But if you believe in liberty, and you believe that, in fact, the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God, and that our government, in fact, is created to we the people, to work for we the people. If you believe that the government works for you, you don't work for the government, then that's what this change is all about. That's why, if you think about it, a centralization of power that's occurred in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, basically since World War II, is trying to be reshifted, and it's being reshifted in the last few years. President Trump was part of that reshifting. What you saw last night was part of that reshifting. So what the founding fathers were able to create was a system that, whether it's irregardless of who's running for office and irregardless of the individuals, if the culture is such that we still believe in liberty, the pendulum swings back and forth between government having too much power and the people having power. And you have to go back and forth between that in times, and that's why these are tumultuous times.
But the sad thing is, so few understand that in this chaos, we saw the people of America take back just a little slice. And we have to do that because the pendulum, as you said, certainly has swung too far. And some of that is intentional.
I think that
some of that's just nature of the beast.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think some people would say, well, I don't want to worry about it. I just want them to tell me what to do and be done with it. Okay. You can surrender your liberties if you want that. But eventually, at some point, it does get personal. When they start saying, you can't live here.
Right.
You have to share this. You can't. What you earn doesn't matter.
Right.
We're about equity, so therefore, if you get an A, but somebody else gets a D, we're going to give everybody a C.
Right.
That's equity. That's communism. And if you want to
Exactly.
read a good book about that, read a book by George Orwell called Animal Farm.
Well, I was going to say, I'm going to make it a little easier. And again, the Marine speaking here, I'm going to dumb it down and make it even simpler. I'm going to tell the nursery tale of the mother hen who wanted to bake bread. Even shorter version, same story. Orwell was absolutely brilliant. And one of the things that scares me is 1984 is coming true. And that's a little bit concerning that so many people in this age, and going back to what we were talking about, computing power, but the internet, and with this age of so much interconnectivity. I mean, we're broadcasting to you on the internet right now. You're listening to us on the internet. There is so much information. There is so much that we can learn. And yet, we are getting farther and farther and farther apart as people. So we've got the music, and we're coming up on another break. This is absolutely fascinating conversation to kick off the year. The timing of it could not have been better. I'm going to ask John to change gears when we come back on the other side of the break, because I want to talk about his book, and I want to talk about applying this to our military and to our leadership that way. But I'm fascinated by your comment that sorry, I was getting notes. Mom was sending me notes, and I, like an idiot, I'm reading them. Letting it break my train of conversation. Hey, we're out, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Veterans Impact Show, and thanks to our sponsors, Fairway Independent Mortgage and Lone Star Wealth Strategies. Now, let's continue this great conversation.
Welcome back. Happy New Year to everybody. I want to thank our guest, Col John Antal, for coming on. We are having a great discussion. It's a very timely discussion as we've kicked off the year, and last night, late into the night, we finally voted on a Speaker of the House. And the interesting thing was, one of the biggest things that's come out of this, again, talking about the internet and interconnectivity, are the pictures that have gone viral of all the congressmen's kids who are up until 1 o'clock in the morning, and they're just sleepy-eyed. And if you know kids, it was something that we could all connect about, and we could all agree on. These poor kids, they didn't have a clue what was going on, but it's been absolutely great. Hey, we're the Veterans Impact Show, and we're going to close out the show. And, John, I'm going to ask you to take just a little bit of a pivot. We've been talking about critical thinking. We've been talking about philosophy. We've been talking about the differences between freedom and liberty, and you've given me something that I've got to think about this afternoon, but some really great points. But one of the things that I talked about at the very start of the show when I introduced you is you are a very forward-thinking person. And in the military, too often, we are busy fighting the last war, not the next war. And the best example I can come up with for our veteran-type listeners or military historians is we think about Pearl Harbor. The Japanese took out all of our battleships. It might have been the biggest favor they could have done the U.S., not that they attacked us and killed a bunch of our people, but they were targeting the aircraft carriers, and the aircraft carriers weren't home, and we had to lean on the aircraft carriers that projected power so much further out. A battleship can shoot, let's say, 20 miles tops. An airplane can hit you at 200 miles or so away, and very much as they did in the Battle of Midway. And really just going with that concept. But John, you have been, with your book Leadership Rising and the 7 Seconds book, and I apologize, I meant to look at it this morning and I didn't. You talked about a battle that was fought in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Yeah, I can't say it. But it was very much fighting that next war, and talk about your work with that, with the current leadership, and you're trying to get people to think in terms of the next war, not the last war.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Thank you. So I wrote a book called 7 Seconds to Die, an analysis of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. Now, that's a mouthful, and most people don't know where Nagorno-Karabakh is or why they should care. Well, here's the deal. In 2020, Azerbaijan attacked Armenian forces in a place called Nagorno-Karabakh in the Caucasus. That's the area just north of Iran, to the east of Turkey and south of Russia. So, in this fight, the Azerbaijanis won in 44 days, decisive military victory, and they used robotic forces to do it. It was the first war in history to be primarily won by robotic forces. Now, by no means was it won by only robotic forces. Azerbaijani soldiers were very involved, and in fact, it's all about the humans leveraging robots. But I emphasize the robots because it's so unique. Now, these robots were loitering munitions, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles. So what this is all sorts of drones, as we call them in the civilian world, that were both used for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and strike. And they were able to pin down the enemy in the battlefield and maneuver around them and win the war in 44 days. Now, in addition to that, I've been studying in depth the Israeli-Hamas war of 2021 and also the current ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. And those three wars bring together lessons learned that I'm briefing our leaders on, and I do all this for no charge. I teach and talk to U.S. military leaders and groups and teams, corps staffs, division staffs, units, and I do this at no charge. And I do this because as a soldier for life, I believe it's important for us to think about the future and learn the lessons and act in time.
Okay, we're actually out of time, and I can't believe we've gotten there this fast. And I really did try not to talk much and talk over you. But I want to thank you for being here. Absolutely fascinating stuff. As I've said, you are one of our absolute favorite guests. For everybody who is listening, Happy New Year. My partner in crime, Jim Blythe, is unfortunately under the weather this morning. I want to thank Nathaniel Smith of Ascend Podcast and the lovely Mrs. Diane Blythe for helping us along the way and handling all the technical side of everything. Col John Antal, you can find his books at leadershiprising.net, best-selling author. We didn't even get to talk about my favorite, which was 7 Leadership Principles of the American Revolution. For everybody, we're out. Thank you so much for being with us.
Cool.
Gesundheit.
Typical Marine.